Hello, world. I know it's been a while, but we've all been very busy with our different life things. And it turns out trying to figure out a time during a busy school year where there's three different people in three different countries trying to get us all to go to the same place at the same time is a little bit tricky sometimes. But here we are again. And today we're going to be discussing biblical translations and the pros and cons and translation methods of each.
Yeah, so there are mainly three different types or different ways that translations are written or made. Um, the first type is called word for word or formal equivalence, and it's pretty simple. It's basically, as it's called, translating word for word. Of course, like making any changes if you have to. Um, like obviously the structure of the languages that the Bible is written in and English don't aren't like structured the same, so it's not possible to like do exactly word for word from Greek or Aramaic into or Hebrew into English. So it's basically translating word for word the important words or the words that have meaning in the sentence. Those words are translated word for word and then rearranged in the structure so that it makes sense in our language. The second type is called functional equivalence, or meaning for meaning, or thought for thought. So basically, instead of translating word for word, in each sentence or phrase, they're taking the meaning of that of those couple words of that phrase or that sentence, and they're translating that meaning, or they're translating that thought. By meaning, I mean like the meaning of the word, not the interpretation of the passage or the sentence. So they're taking what that thought is and translating it rather than translating word for word. Basically, they're translating the same idea. And that's a little bit less specific than word for word. And then the last one would be a paraphrase or a retelling. And that takes the thought for thought translation or the functional equivalence translation a step further, and it restates the passage or the words or the sentences, as well as translating its meaning or interpretation. So it's like restating the passage as similar to like thought for thought would go, but then also interpreting it for you or stating what those words mean for you. By meaning, I mean not the translation or the idea, but the interpretation of that. And so I think we're safe with word for word. I would be pretty fine with any translations in that category. Most of the meaning for meaning or thought for thought functional equivalence translations are pretty reliable. I think that translation method is good. The paraphrase translation, any of the translations in that category, I don't think I would find very reliable. Not that you can't read them, but that I would definitely not use the translation from that category for like studying or being your primary translation that you're using. So examples of word for word translations would be the English Standard Version, the ESV, and the New American Standard Bible, the NASB. And then meaning for meaning, thought for thought translations would be the NIV, the CSB. Paraphrases would be the message and um, maybe NLT. NLT is kind of somewhere in between paraphrase and thought for thought. It's kind of in between that. Some of it is thought for thought translation, and some of it is interpreted or paraphrased by that definition. So basically, that's those are the three main methods for translation, and most translations fall within those or somewhere between.
Yeah, for sure. Um, I'll add on to that just a little bit. As someone who's now almost through second semester of Koine Greek, there's, like she said, the ESV and the NASB claim to be word for word. And if you take any foreign language, you know that a true word for word from one language to another is impossible. And so the sentiment is there, but even all translation is interpretation. to a degree. It just depending on your translation of the Bible, the to a certain degree is what varies. And so, based on some statistics I looked up, they were all a little bit different, and so I kind of just averaged them together. But the seven most commonly used Bibles today were the NIV, the KJV, the ESV, the NLT, the NKJV, and the NASB. And usually the NIV was shown to be the most prevalent. 30 to 35% of Christians use the NIV. 20 to 35% of Christians use the KJV, but this is more in decline. We see older generations and maybe more firmly seated denominations continuing to stress the use of the King James Version, but overall it's in decline. The ESV and the NLT are both growing in usage, and those are coming in at about 10 to 15% of Christians. The New King James Version is sitting around 5 to 10%. The New American Standard Bible, like Elise mentioned, is about 5 to 10%. And then we see the message being used between 2 to 5% of people. And so I'll start with the NIV. The NIV is very readable. And it uses a mix of word for word versus thought intended, but it is more towards the thought intended side of that graph, if you will. It uses, since it's newer and new manuscripts have been discovered, it uses more reliable and more comparative manuscripts. So, like the textual consistency and, oh, are we sure this is the inspired word of God? That shouldn't be a big issue. However, it is less precise than some other translations because the people who translated it had to decide what the text meant before translating it. And I mean, this applies to all of them in a way, but it's back to the thought for thought versus word for word, like we've already talked about. And especially the newer editions of the NIV, it uses gender inclusive language. So instead of brethren, it'll be brothers and sisters, things like that. Swapping out the word, in Greek, it's doulos, which can be translated slave, but because of cultural um, things with that in America and the history of slavery, they've translated that to servant. And just the confusion of what slave meant in the ancient world because it could be a servant. Things like that, gender inclusive language, things like that have been changed for the NIV. For the ESV, it claims to be word for word. I have an ESV. That's what I use the most. And so because of that, it's good in like expository preaching or deep text studies. Some might criticize it as favoring Reformed theology. I haven't really found that, but perhaps. Um, and it favors accuracy to the original manuscripts more than the NIV. Um, I'll come back to the NLT. Uh, the NASB, New American Standard Bible, is the most literal translation that I could find, and it is as word for word as English allows. But because it's the most literal, it's stiff and awkward English, and being too literal can actually obscure the meaning of the Greek or of the text. So it's not as beautiful or poetic as the King James Version or even the NIV. And it can be confusing sometimes, but if you want the most literal translation, then from my research, it seems like the NASB is as close as you're going to get. The New King James Version is just an updated King James Version with newer manuscripts and replacing thee, thou, thine, plural form of you as you, stuff like that. The message was never intended to be a legitimate translation. It was a paraphrase, and from my research, it was advertised as a paraphrase. It was written by a Presbyterian pastor in the PCUSA organization. It was a paraphrase that tried to update the Bible with modern metaphors. If you've ever read any part of the message, it sometimes does it in hilarious ways. Forgot the verse off the top of my head, but it says something in the Old Testament that compares it to meat and potatoes. I tried to find it before in this podcast, but I couldn't. But obviously, since it was produced by originally produced by one pastor in a specific denomination. It is very biased in some places, but they did have the humility to admit that it was not supposed to be a legitimate translation, just like an Abe paraphrasing. Um, and obviously, it's the least precise, it's the least literal. And like I said, can have some hilarious takes on verses, but also I think has a place and can be useful, perhaps especially when trying to convert new Christians and trying to get them to understand like what some ancient metaphors mean and things. But I've only known one person who's used the message as his only translation of the Bible, and I would not recommend using the message as your only translation. Um, you have anything to add through all that before we get to the KJV or NLT, Elise?
I pretty much agree with everything you said. Yeah, a lot of new things that I didn't know, so that's pretty cool. But yeah, we can move on to the NLT and then we can do the KJV. My view might be a little bit different than yours. So my mom uses the NLT mostly, so I got a lot of this information or this opinion from her. I do not use the NLT and would prefer not to as my main translation for studying the Bible. But there are definitely some good uses for it and a place for it. It's in very like simple, understandable language, which makes it good for people who uh, do not have English as their first language. So that's a reason that my parents would use it a lot. And it's like the translation we read in church. So for people who are just listening or aren't following along, it's a very like simple, understandable version to read. In church. So there are definitely good uses for it, but it does fall like somewhere between a paraphrase and the thought for thought translation. So it definitely does have some places in it where you're just kind of like, wait a second, that doesn't seem right. And so if you're going to use it as your main study Bible, you definitely need to be able to identify those places where something seems a little off. Because there've even been places where I found that it seems to contradict other parts of the Bible. Or if you compare it with a word for word translation, it would have a completely different interpretation because the NLT kind of uh, tells the interpretation or tries to interpret it for you instead of saying exactly what was supposed to be there. It says this is what it means. Um, So I think the NLT is not a bad translation, but it's not one you should use unless you can identify the parts where something's a little off and it's trying to interpret it for you. So like have something else to compare it to, whether it's another translation that is more literal or a person who can distinguish those passages. If you have someone like that, then go ahead and use it. I don't see a problem in it because it is simple and it's good for people who are reading the Bible for the first time or don't have a good background in English. But yeah, I think after you're more advanced in your English and your reading of the Bible and interpretation of it, the NLT may not be the best idea. And maybe you could move on to other translations. But yeah, that's my opinion. It's one you have to be careful with, not that you should avoid, but one that you have to be very aware of, like what is in it and be watching out, not just take everything that it says to heart. Just be like cautious as you're reading it.
Yeah. And I think I don't know if I would use the term like it's a good translation or a bad translation exactly. Like there's different styles and there's not really a bad translation. But I agree with what you're saying. It is thought for thought rather than word for word, like the emphasis. It's one of the easiest translations to read, like you said, but it focuses more on the meaning rather than structure. And so sometimes it interprets metaphors and then translates the interpretation rather than the metaphor a few times. It can also simplify difficult or complex ideas, and is probably one of the least literal, just because it focuses on simplicity. Um, the history of the NLT, uh, It was expanded from the paraphrases of a man named Kenneth Taylor, who was an evangelical Baptist pastor, I believe. And then those paraphrases, basically, the committee looked at his paraphrases and then kind of expanded it into a Bible. And so, because of this, there are some pretty, it's kind of like the message. It can be very biased in some places and subtly biased in others. For example, there's been discussions on like how good the translations about gender roles in the church or how they treated the passages of gender roles in the church, how well those were treated. And also, this verse has been mentioned uh, a few times on this podcast and other episodes. Uh, Let me go ahead and read it. I also say when I study a passage, I try to look at different translations and not just only one, because I think comparing the translations and seeing how they translated it differently is useful. But especially when we're talking about things like baptism, 1 Peter 3:21, and from my ESV says, baptism which corresponds to this now saves you, not as a removal of dirt from the body, etc. In the NLT, it says, and that water is a picture of baptism, which now saves you, et cetera, et cetera. Um, Now, whatever your views are on, baptism and salvation and all those things, and like other passages, like I said, gender roles might be affected a little bit. Uh, the way that the NLT translated it, and that water is a picture of baptism, I I think whatever your views are, I think it's pretty clear to tell that there was some things, there was definitely interpretation, excess interpretation, how about that, and bias added into that passage before it was translated because there's no Greek word for or Greek words for and that water is a picture of. It's just baptizos and then the rest of the verse. So there's some biases like that in the NLT, but like I said, and like Elise said, it is easy to read, comfortable to read, and it does good a job at simplifying the message, which has pros and cons. But I think it's a legitimate translation that can be used for good.
Yeah, totally. And I mean, whether I agree with their interpretation or not doesn't really matter because that's not a translation's job. The translation's job is not to interpret it for you, tell you this is what that means. It's just supposed to tell you this is what it says. And so the NLT does
Right.
that sometimes, and so that's why you have to be like, okay, wait a second. Is this is this telling me what the Bible says or what it means? So just as long as you can identify that, because you should be reading the actual scripture and um, discerning what it means, not letting the translation do that for you. Um,
Yep.
so yeah, I would agree. And then moving on to the KJV, do you want to do that? Are you
Yeah.
ready to move on? So I have a few things. You probably have a lot more to say about it than I do, just because you know more things. But I mean there are quite a few cons to the KJV. And I'm not saying that it's like the worst translation or a bad translation, like you were saying. It's just definitely not the best, and a lot of people treat it as superior or as the only translation you should use. And I think that is definitely not a correct opinion. Um, and so one con is that it's very hard to understand. The KJV is very hard to understand. The NKJV is a lot easier. I have this little excerpt from an article I read. Oh man, I was going to write the person who wrote this, but I can't find it. Um, this is not my own words. I don't know whose credit it is, though. I don't know if I'm allowed to do that, but I'm doing it. It says the first translation or oh wait, it says the first has to do with the translation itself. In the last 400 years, the English language has changed dramatically, making it hard to understand the many archaic usages found in the King James Version. For example, the KJV uses the word conversation when it actually means conduct or lifestyle. Another example is the KJV uses the word suffer when it really means permit. So in Matthew 19:14, the King James reads, "Suffer the little children to come to me." No one wants little children to suffer. It should be translated, "Allow the little children to come to me." Many have recognized the problem with the KJV using archaic language, and therefore the New King James Version was translated, and that's an excellent modern translation. So yeah, basically there's a lot of there's almost a language barrier between modern English and the KJV. But the NKJV did fix that problem, even though I could still argue that the KJV would be a bit hard to understand for some people. Others might not have that much trouble understanding it. Um, Another con to the KJV, um, some people's uh argument for why it's superior or should be the only version used is that it's like the original authorized version or the most legitimate version. And actually the original authorized version in the West is the Vulgate. The Vulgate is considered the original authorized version, and that's in Latin. So if you really want to get down to like the most authorized, the most legitimate, you can go read the Vulgate in Latin, or you can just go ahead and learn Greek and Hebrew while you're at it. So I feel like that's kind of a weak argument to defend the KJV. That's not really a con of the KJV, just an incorrect claim by a lot of people who claim that the KJV is superior or the only correct version. Um, the KJV also, this is probably the biggest problem with the KJV and the NKJV is that it isn't the closest we have to Jesus or the original manuscripts. It was written before the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, and the Dead Sea Scrolls bring us 1,000 years closer to when those events actually happened. What were the Dead Sea Scrolls? Were they all of the books of the Bible except Esther? Was it the Old Testament and the New Testament? Or just the Old Testament?
Uh, Let me research that real quick. I have an answer, but I don't want to say something wrong, so give me
Okay,
a
you research
second.
that, and then you can say it when I'm done. Um, and so the translations that came from the oldest manuscripts are going to be more accurate than the translations written from the more modern manuscripts. So we didn't have the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were 1,000 years older than whatever they had at the time when the KJV was translated. So that makes it less accurate because we're all going to agree that the older the manuscripts are, the closer they were to the time of when those events actually happened, the more accurate they're going to be. And then another problem, which is probably equally as important, is that the KJV has additions that weren't in the original manuscripts that it was translated from. One example we've talked about a few episodes ago was in First John. Can't remember the exact verse.
5-7.
Yes, 5:7, you're right. And it adds a clarification about the Trinity that wasn't there. I think Monk just added it to like confirm their Trinity, their doctrine of the Trinity, and I'm pretty sure it does that in some other places as well that I don't know specifically. But there are additions to the KJV that weren't in any of the manuscripts, the original manuscripts that they had at the time, not even counting the Dead Sea Scrolls. So we don't want a translation as our primary translation that has additions that were not from original manuscripts in it. And so if you're reading the KJV or the NKJV, whether it's your primary translation or not, you should be aware of that and be able to identify those places or do your research beforehand just so that you're not deceived into thinking something or being tricked by something that's in the translation that isn't supposed to be there. So overall, yes, the language is beautiful and it's cool to read, and there's nothing wrong with reading it for like that purpose, like because it's artistic, but I wouldn't recommend using it as your only or primary translation for studying God's word, just because we want to be the most accurate that we can and not be subject to studying or believing something that isn't true just because of the translation we have when there are plenty available that are more accurate. So, yeah, there are a few problems with the KJV. Not that you should never read it, but it's definitely not best or only translation that is legitimate.
Yeah, I think that's fair assessment. Answer your question, Dead Sea Scrolls. It included fragments from every book of the Old Testament except the book of Esther, in addition to many apocrypha and some religious writings of the believed to be Essenes, which was basically a different sect of Judaism, which was different from the Pharisees and the Sadducees. But yes, that was the Dead Sea Scrolls. Also, I would be remiss. Our favorite British person, Lily Price, couldn't be here today, and I told her that I would share her wisdom on this topic. And so her her wisdom verbatim is my wisdom. The big book says his word will never be lost. So even if some folks try to rewrite the truth, they can't make it go away.
There you have
So
it, Lily Price.
people have very distinct beliefs on the King James Version. And so this may or may not ruffle some feathers, but I'm going to start off with kind of where Elise ended, the textual reliability of the King James Version. You know, if you want to go check out a discussion of passages like John 8, 1 through 11, or Mark 16, 9 through 20, or 1 John 5, 7, or Acts 8, 37, you can go watch season 2, episode 5, shameless plug, where we discussed these passages that may or may not have been included in the original manuscripts. But since the King James Version was written in an older time, uh, not as many manuscripts were readily available, and so the textual reliability might be lacking, although there's nothing uh, insanely different or like heretical contained within. One of the, besides the beautiful language, and like, I will say, one thing that the King James Version does really well is respecting God and singular versus plural you. This is something that modern English kind of lacks sometimes because, um, personal pronouns, I, first singular, you, second singular, he, she, it, third singular, and then first plural is we, second plural is also you, and then, third plural is they. And so, especially when you're translating verbs and new modern translations, uh, versus you can sometimes be, oh, is this singular or plural? So you're referring to one specific person or a group of people. Um, that can be sometimes difficult to distinguish. And so the King James Version does a good job uh, distinguishing that between ye and thou, thee, thine, all of those different things. That is one thing it does well. And also, like Elise mentioned, it is very beautiful language, and very poetic. And it does a good job respecting the authority of the Bible. One of the biggest arguments I always hear for the King James Version is that since it was written so long ago, it was written without an agenda. And first off, pretty much every translation was written with an agenda. However, certain translations like the NLT or the Message, as we've already discussed, come from a specific religious group of people, and so are going to be biased in one way or more over another. Um, Translations like the NIV or ESV have, committees of 25, 50, 75 people from different religious groups or even atheists who usually treat the text more fairly, in my opinion. But anyways, King James Version was not written with an agenda. Well, if you look at why the King James Version was written, it's because James the First of England became king, and the two most common Bibles at the time, the Geneva Bible, had controversial notes against monarchy, and the other Bible at the time, the Bishop's Bible, was just not very well respected. And so James the First became king, and he ordered a new translation made. And so 47 scholars worked on the King James Version, and instead of, they kind of flipped the Geneva Bible. Instead of the controversial notes against monarchy, they made it not exactly pro-monarchy, but they made it pro-church and pro-structure. And so, in a way, it was written with an agenda, and it's not perfect. And we also see the King James Version being the root of most of the transliterations that we have today. Now, don't get me wrong, not all transliterations are bad. Like Christ is a transliteration, Satan is a transliteration, the devil is a transliteration. All of those things are transliterations, but there are a few doctrinal, important, and widely debated doctrinal issues that it is kind of a big deal that is transliteration. As we know, the whole discussion of baptizo, should that be translated baptized or immerse? Well, immerse means, completely under the water. Baptize can mean a wide variety of things. And so the transliterating it baptized instead of immersion um, lined up with the Church of England's views on infant baptism and sprinkling and some things like that. We also see some difficulty translating, and this exists for all translations, angel versus messenger, because they both came from the same word, angelos. Um, but we also see when we're looking at church authority, bishop versus pastor versus elder versus presbyter versus overseer. All of those words could be used interchangeably, but every time in the King James Version, as far as I'm aware, it was translated bishop as a way to emphasize the denominational and church structure of the Church of England and other churches at the time. We also see another thing emphasizing the pro-church and pro-structure kind of agenda, if you will, of the Bible. Um, Translating church versus congregation. Like, is it referring to the church as a whole, or is it referring to a congregation of a specific group of people in a specific city? So things like that, that I would, that would be my counter argument to the King James Version is old, and so it was not written with an agenda and it's unbiased. Well, it was. And so, kind of that to add on to what Elise was saying, I do still think it is a viable translation. I've used a King James Version in my life, and I'm still going to continue to. And I think, like I said, it does a good job distinguishing like singular plural you versus uh, second second singular you versus second plural y'all, if you will. It does a good job doing that. It does a good job of beautiful language. It does a good job of poetry. It does a good job respecting God and his authority. But there are some uh, things like the fact it was written for a specific denomination. So it was written for an agenda. It was things were transliterated to favor a certain point of view. And the textual reliability concerns. I think all of that needs to be considered before you make a concrete uh, decision about how much you use the King James Version.
That was interesting. I did not know that about like the history and the agenda, but that makes sense. Well, since we have some extra time left, we're going to answer one of our discussion questions. Today's question is, why do people search for God, but he doesn't show himself at all?
The way I would look at it is, why do people search for God, but he doesn't show himself at all? I would say there's three reasons, I suppose. The first one is they're searching for him in the wrong places. The second reason would be their understanding of him in the world today is not biblically founded. And third is they're just not, they might be ignorant of the ways that God does show himself. And so I'll probably discuss those in reverse order. Like, we know that God shows himself through his creation, and that, creation screams of a creator or a designer, and just, you can literally go into any field, not even in science, in art. You can go into just about any field. And when you look at the way that the world was designed and the way that everything is interconnected, and the way that just, a few degrees here, a few more cells there, or a few more joules of energy here, everything is so intricately balanced. The probability of one of these things happening is 10 to the 30. But the probability of all of these happening and all of these happening by themselves is just so infinitesimally small. Even with billions or trillions of years, it just wouldn't happen. And so you see just the mighty power and the awe of God's creation. That is a way that he does show himself. But then the other two, um, different religious groups, like I said, have different beliefs about how God shows himself. And so maybe some of those are wrong. And so maybe when God doesn't show himself in those ways, then people feel like they're searching for God, but they can't find him because maybe they're looking for like a miraculous manifestation and it doesn't happen. And they take it to mean, oh, God doesn't love me, or God doesn't care about me, or even God isn't real. And I don't think that's exactly the way to do it. And then the first reason I mentioned, I think, was they're looking for God in the wrong places. And this is kind of the same thing, not even necessarily meaning like they're looking for God in sin, but they're expecting God to um, miraculously respond to them in ways that just aren't guaranteed in Scripture. We know that God speaks to us through His Word. We know that God shows Himself in His creation, and we know that God guides us through the indwelling of the Holy Spirit upon salvation. And even our extent of like how he does each of those things is not there. But it really is a bigger question of faith and recognition of the ways that God does show himself. So if someone's searching for God, but they feel like he's not showing himself at all, um, then maybe I promise this isn't condescending. I'm trying to think of a way of making it not sound condescending, but maybe just a reevaluation of their beliefs of how God does interact with the world and looking at a more biblically sounded way that God shows himself would be useful if you feel like you're trying to search for God and not being able to find him.
Yeah, I definitely agree with the fact that, like what you said about creation. Like, I feel like creation is God's biggest, this is who I am moment. Like, you can't look at creation and be like, there isn't a God. It's definitely one of the most obvious ways he reveals himself. But I think a verse worth noting that's definitely related to this topic is Jeremiah 29:13. It says, "You will seek me and find me when you seek me with all your heart." And so that gives me the confidence that if someone is actually looking for him, they will find him. So why are you not finding him if you're looking for him? I think, trying not to make this sound condescending, you're not really looking for him because or you're like making an excuse by saying that. I know some people who like say, I'm just waiting for God to give me a sign and then I'll believe in him. Like, I know it's true, but I need a sign from him. And that just becomes like kind of you stalling. Uh, Basically, you're saying he's not showing himself to me. Even one person said that to me once. He said, once God shows me a sign, I'll believe in him. And I was like, what if God's sign is him sending a family to you from across the world, and out of 20 million people in this city, they find you and they decide to tell you about him? Is that not a sign? And he was like, I don't know about that. So I think you can seek and God will show himself, but it's also your job to recognize when he is showing himself. And that moves me to like another point where some people, when they ask that question, are asking, why isn't it obvious? Like, if God really wanted me to believe in him, why do I have to have faith in it? Why can't he just be like, this is me, I'm God? Um, and I think the answer to that is that it's not faith. It's not you choosing God if it's obvious. If there's no faith involved, then you don't have another choice but to believe in him. If it was written across the sky, Jesus is God, then are you really choosing him, or are you believing him in him out of obligation because there's no other alternative, or you have no other option but to believe it's true because it's so obvious. So like, he puts him in a place himself in a place where there's enough evidence to where people who seek him will find him, but also there's enough mystery to where people who don't seek him will not find him. So he puts himself in that perfect spot. And so I think if you're seeking him, you will find him. Maybe it won't be obvious 100% sure after the first day, but he promises that everyone who seeks him will find him. So that gives me confidence knowing that that's true. I don't know if that would give someone who's seeking him a confidence and doesn't seem to find him, but yeah, I think he's showing himself to anyone who's truly seeking him, and it's your job to identify that and not turn this I'm not seeing him into an excuse and make yourself ignore all of the signs of him showing himself to you just to make an excuse not to make a commitment. And I think that is something that a lot of people do. Not everybody, but a lot of people just say, I'm waiting for a sign so that they can stall because something else is stopping them from putting their faith in God. So those are my few thoughts.
Yeah, and I think maybe something else to add. It seems to me, from my understanding, that God has, this is kind of a, oh, really? Duh. I'm glad you finally figured it out, William. But like God has a specific way he wants his people to interact with each other, and God has a specific way he wants to like be worshipped, and God has a specific way that he wants to be found. And so I agree. He is findable, and people who seek him will find him, but maybe if they find him in the way that God's expect in the way that God wants to be found. Like God might not be found in every miraculous manifestation that you expect or want, but God can be found in the blessings that you've received in your life, like uh, a family or friends or support or a loving congregation, a loving church, things like this. You can always find God in specific areas and blessings of life.
Yeah. And I
But yeah.
mean, I wouldn't say you have to seek him in a certain way to find him. I think anyone who looks for him, regardless of their strategy, is going to find him. But it's just what seeking means. Seeking means you're looking for him. You're not just saying, do this for me and then I'll believe in you. That's not seeking. Seeking is actually looking for signs of is he real, for proof of is he real, evidence of is God, uh, is Jesus God, whatever they're looking for, is God real? So true seeking, no matter how you do it, no matter what method you use, is going to lead to God. But you just got to make sure you're actually seeking, not demanding something from God and saying, if you do this for me, then I'll believe in you, which some people translate seeking as to, or translate that as seeking, when seeking is actually looking for God in the way he reveals himself, not asking him to reveal himself in the way that would make you happy.
Alrighty, well, thank y'all for tuning in today. Join us next time for a discussion about something. Maybe it'll be the Crusades. Maybe it'll be God's mercy and judgment. Maybe it'll be the church and mental health. We have a lot of topics that we want to discuss still, but we still don't know what we're going to talk about yet. And hopefully, we'll either have some guests on next time or Lily Price will be back, so you don't only have to listen to me and Elise yap the whole time. Anyways, thank you all for taking time out of your day to listen to us, and we hope you have a great rest of your day. Thank you. Thank you.